I'm always going to be a traditional painter at heart. These examples here that you're looking at are some of my hand-drawn and hand-painted trompe-l'oeil. But I started adopting digital technology way back in 2006 with a friend and business partner that I had at the time, Mark Kusek. We introduced digitally created and printed marquetry for floors and furniture at the Kips Bay Show House. Nobody was trying to do anything like what we were attempting at the time. So a lot of new technologies seem to go through this nascent phase when in their early stages of development, where they seem to just copy the old technology. It's almost like a pastiche. Think of early electronic music, where it just basically made snare drum sounds and piano noises, but like within a couple of seconds it moved beyond that and kind of became something unto itself. Now it's just electronic music. It's not trying to copy anything. Well, I'm not sure exactly why, but I feel like in the decorative arts, if computers are used at all, it's still either to copy what was done before, or it's really just used in one of two basic ways. The first basic method is to paint small, print large. Here I am hand painting a mural on my desktop using a magnifying glass. There are a number of companies employing this simple technique. Once I scan the painting at a very high resolution, I can then print it out full scale. Here I've printed a section 10 feet tall. In this case, it took me roughly 2 days to paint that section, which is of course way faster than I could ever have done it on site, and it's all from the comfort of a small studio. And once it's in the computer, I can customize it any way I want. Here I've added trompe-l'oeil columns and architecture. Second basic method is to paint one and print many. Here I've taken that initial hand-painted rosette and combined it in Photoshop with a bunch of other hand-painted elements. Now I can just print out as much as I want. These are both perfectly reasonable ways of using, leveraging the power of computers, but they're not particularly inventive. You're really just bringing the computer in at the very end to do all the heavy lifting of creating multiples. All the production is still done by hand. It's just the reproduction that's done by computers. So right from the beginning, Mark and I set ourselves the goal of seeing just how far we could involve computers in the actual production without actually losing sight of what we were hoping to achieve, which was this very traditional kind of classical sense of the beautiful interior. First step is always to learn the limitations of whatever tool I'm using before I can try and come up with new ways of using it. What can the tool do and what can't it do? The machine, in this case, the printer itself, doesn't really care what it prints on. We've had incredible success printing on all sorts of different things. We even invented our own printable floor tiles. These were made from white, tongued and grooved HDF. And then we developed modular floor layouts that could be printed in squares and basically jigsawed all together by the installer. But really what we wanted to do was come up with something that the printer manufacturers hadn't even thought of doing. So we approached a bunch of large format printers and asked them if we could experiment on their machines, which they were actually very willing to do. And one of the first things we discovered, we were looking into a type of printing called UV or ultraviolet printing, is that the machine itself has essentially two element components to the print head. There's the part of the print head that spits out the ink, and then the second part that moves directly behind it on this moving arm that is an ultraviolet light. And the light is, when it's on, it bakes the ink as it comes out and cures it, drying it, right? But you could turn off the ultraviolet light and then the ink wouldn't dry essentially. But the interesting thing about this machine is besides only just printing ink, it also prints varnish. So we thought, well, what if we took one of our like super intricate kind of ornamental designs, and instead of printing it in ink, we printed it in varnish, but we told the printer to turn off the UV head. So in other words, the image would come out printed in varnish, but it wouldn't be dry, it would still be wet. Anyone familiar with traditional gilding, you might see that this is potentially huge. I mean, you're basically talking about printing your gold size. If you're a gilder setting out to put an elaborate design onto a surface, your first step is normally to hand paint your design in the gold size. Then you come along and you apply your individual sheets. The gold only sticks to the areas that you've sized and basically dusts off everywhere else. This process of laying down size in any kind of intricate pattern is very time consuming. But here we basically found a way around all of that. So there are two main reasons that you use traditional gold size, besides adhering to tradition. One is that it lays out super smooth, like no brush strokes, so that when your gold goes on, it's like you can burnish it to a high sheen. And the other is that the gold size stays tacky for a long time, right? So it's a long open time. But the thing is about this UV varnish, if we turned off the UV light, when the UV varnish came out sticky, it basically had the same properties. So we discovered that we could use that as gold size, which meant that we could actually skip all of that time-consuming process at the beginning of either masking off the area that you were going to do or getting out tiny brushes and hand painting all these designs. Now, all our design came out already sized, essentially, in varnish. And all we had to do was just put our gold onto it and wait for it to kind of dry ambiently. It would dry with just a kind of ambient UV in the atmosphere, and then just dust off the rest of the gold the same way you would with real gold size, except now that we were completely unlimited in scope and scale. Plus, it was way, way, way faster. This was like a massive innovation. Nobody had ever even thought of doing this. Plus, at the end of the day, it is a gilded piece. It's not a printed metallic piece. It's actual gold that we are hand applying. It's just that the production process has been vastly improved, simplified by the addition of digital technology. We decided to see if we could take it further. Anyone familiar with glass blowing knows that the method of getting a gilded design onto blown glass is quite crude. You basically just roll the blowpipe with the molten glass back and forth across a metal slab called a marver. It's been covered in loose leaves of gold. And once the glass is cooled, the gold on the surface has to be intricately etched or scratched away wherever you don't want it in order to reveal your design. You're basically working in reverse. So we thought this would be a great place to do some experimenting. So we fed one of our ornamental designs through the UV printer, printing it out in varnish, turning off the UV light so that the design, our print, came out in wet varnish. Printed this time not on paper, but on tissue paper, like super thin tissue paper, the thinnest we could find. And then once it was out, still wet, we gilded it, we put our gold leaf on it, waited for it to dry, dusted it off. So now we've got a finished gilded design in 22 karat gold on tissue paper. So we took it to the glass blower, placed this finished tissue paper design on the marver, on the metal slab, and she comes out with the blowpipe with the big blob of molten glass and just rolls the glass across the marver, across the tissue paper. Tissue paper, of course, is 1,000 degrees. The glass just bursts into flames, so the tissue paper just turns to ash and smoke and just disappears. But the gold doesn't burn and the gold doesn't melt, so it just stuck to the glass. So that was how we transferred from the tissue paper onto this molten glass. So this was groundbreaking, because frankly it had never been tried. We kind of completely skipped this whole process, which was messy and wasteful of gold, where there's no more need to etch into anything, right? So because essentially the printer was doing all the etching, it just created the design. So that was like 2,000 years of glass blowing that just had never been done any other way, that we kind of applied this print technology to and came up with something really quite unique. It was a lot of fun coming up with all these new ways of using computer technology, but at the same time we were still only kind of incorporating computers at the end of the process. It was really at the print stage and not the production stage. In other words, most of the work, if not all of the work, was still being done by hand. You just kind of bring computers in at the end. What we thought would be more exciting was to see how much we could kind of involve digital technology during the early stages and the production stages, right? So we started to think of our handmade process like a deck of cards. So you've got all these different steps that go, in the process of creating something by hand. So we thought, well, what if we interrupted that handmade process somewhere in the middle and took out one of those cards or those steps, those handmade steps, replaced it with digital technology? So what you have at the end then is a process. Well, your product is still handmade at the end, but it's it's digitally assisted, right? So the computers are kind of involved somewhere in the middle of the thing. At this point, you're kind of moving beyond the kind of paint one, print many model, and you're where the computer's really only introduced at the end. So now you're really incorporating it into the process. But the main question, of course, is like, why would you bother? Like, why put down all your hand tools and then just pick up a computer if you're only just going to pick up your hand tools again afterwards, especially if this product is really just going to look hand done at the end. What are you gaining? The digital step introduces three important things. Firstly, it's much faster than any traditional step. It's also easier to adjust and modify than any handmade step when you need to make changes. It's also easier to make multiples digitally. Let me give you an example. This is a project I created in the style of 18th century French chinoiserie. Very traditional, still hugely popular. The project called for creating over 20 individual panels, each one to have its own figurative vignette hand-painted in the center and framed around the outside by an ornamental chinoiserie border that you can see here in red. So the traditional process when you're producing any kind of painted ornament like this is to use layers and layers of tracing paper, and we draw an increasing detail on each layer until you finally ironed out all your issues with detail, proportion, and composition. When we've done all that, we move on to the transfer stage. So now you want to take your drawing and transfer it from the paper onto the canvas. There's two main ways of doing that. One is you flip the drawing over, rub a bunch of chalk into the back, turn it back over again, put it on your canvas, and then trace over it like carbon paper. The second step is to create what we call a pounce pattern. Generally, you choose to do a pounce pattern if you're expecting to paint multiples of your design. The technique involves using a needle to poke holes roughly 1/8 of an inch apart along the entire outline of whatever drawing is to be transferred, in this case our ornamental frame. We then take this drawing full of holes and place it on top of our prepared canvas, and we use a little ball of cotton containing powdered chalk, we call a pounce doll, and we push powder through the holes and onto the canvas. Once we remove the drawing, we can see that our design has transferred as a pattern of tiny chalk dots directly onto the canvas. Then we mix an opaque medium value of our ornament, red in this case, and using the chalk dots as a guide, we fill in the shape outlined by the dots into a solid silhouette of our frame design. It should look, when it's finished, like a stenciled solid red shape which serves as the base for our trompe-l'oeil. At that point, we begin to hand paint our drop shadows, our highlights, lowlights, to give it the final effect of 3 dimensions that you see here. And we can also choose to apply a toning glaze over the top of the whole thing at the very end. But here's the thing, like, all of that stuff could have been done digitally. I mean, why do it by hand when you've got, right from the beginning, where you've got your base painted canvas, it's got like an off-white Pharaoh ball, Benjamin or whatever. From that point, right up until the point where you've got an outline of basically looks like a stencil solid red outline of your shape. All of that stuff, the sketching, the tracing paper, the pouncing, the transfer of the image, and then this infilling, of course, with the paintbrush, which you have to do like sometimes several coats, right, to get a solid coat. I mean, basically, my way of thinking is if my goal is to get a solid shape, that's it. And on top of that, I'm going to do my trompe-l'oeil. I'm going to paint my highlights and my shadows. But if the goal, like the intermediate goal, is just to have that solid shape, I don't care how it's done. I just want it done. And if I can do it way faster, which I definitely can digitally, then I'm going to do that. So then the only thing that I have to do is basically do the finishing touches, which are just like highlights, shadows, drop shadows, all of that stuff. But most of the work is done, the grunt work is done for me. So here's how I do it digitally. First, I gather a bunch of individual elements together into a digital library. Many of these ornamental forms, like the acanthus scroll, for example, crop up over and over, so I'll reuse old elements that I've hand painted, as well as creating new ones as needed. And I can easily turn these into solid shapes. Or I'll draw my own vectors, which are basically scalable outlines, such as these ones inspired by Robert Adam. So either manually in black ink or digitally on my Wacom tablet, I'll quickly paint solid black shapes of separate elements and then dump them all together. Everything then becomes part of this big digital grab bag of individual elements that I can pull from. Then I open a Photoshop file and I start playing with them, jigsawing everything together onto separate layers. And once I have a design that I like, I can superimpose any color on top and print it out using my wide format digital printer directly onto canvas that I've base painted with Benjamin Moore or Faro and Ball latex paint. Now, there was nothing stopping me from using my Wacom tablet and my digital paintbrushes to paint the same three-dimensional effects right on my computer screen instead of doing it by hand. And then I could have just printed out the entire thing and it would have been finished. This sample here was painted entirely using digital brushes on my Wacom tablet. But what we're going for here is kind of a hybrid method. At the end, I mean, it's digitally helped, but I want it to be hand painted at the end, right? So it's really just using the computers in the middle, and then kind of like autopilot, you turn it off and then you take the controls just before you land the plane. We're basically doing the same thing with our brushes. So here's our starting point. You have the solid red outline of your ornament. And this is what I'm suggesting you could print out and save yourself all the trouble of hand painting that in. And at the same time, why not print out another color? Say there's some green elements here, part of the ornament. You could print them out as part of the base coat. And also, if there's a color on the outside of the frame, you might consider printing that as well. That could be part of the print. It's a lot of time to in-paint all of those things. And then there are also things that we can add on once we're at it. If we want to add a scumble or a strié, and we can play around with these levels until we feel they're at a place where we like them, and then all of that stuff could be printed out as part of the initial painting before we take out our hand tools and start actually painting in our highlights and our shadows, etc. And then eventually this is where we end up with this fully realized, hand-painted, hand-finished rather, project. So pretty quickly you can start to see how one person could potentially do the work of, an entire crew of people. And not only that, but you could do it from a small home office instead of having a giant studio, right? It's just while it's going through the printer, I've got time to do other stuff. I'm not doing the work, the printer is. Okay, so let's finish up with this whole deck of cards idea that I was kind of running through in this chinoiserie project. So again, what's important to consider here is the goal. Okay, what am I hoping to achieve? It's that question right from the very beginning of the talk. I don't really care what tool I use. If it suits me, if it's faster, if it's more efficient to use a digital tool, I'll do that. If it's more efficient and faster, which it rarely is, to do a handmade, I'll do that. The choice of which tool to use that's the secondary consideration. So in this case, what I'm hoping to achieve is creating this like solid blue ornamental frame. And I don't care if it's printed or painted. I just know that it's way faster to print it, so I'll print it. I could spend days and days and days printing it manually, or painting it rather manually, but why would I bother? Like, I'd rather keep that time to myself and do something else with it. So I use the computer. Right from the beginning, we can incorporate computers in both the sketching and the mock-up stages. This follows quite naturally from the initial email exchanges where you're bouncing ideas and inspiration back and forth. It's a simple next step to superimpose those reference images on top of architects' elevations. I drew these up in Photoshop. And from there, of course, it's a short skip to creating digital renderings. For example, these are mural elevations I created in Photoshop for a project, which I then warped and superimposed on top of a photograph of the actual space. So the same benefits as before apply. You're introducing efficiency because you've got this kind of seamless transition from the early stages of email exchanges right into production. And you're introducing the ability to easily make changes, which is probably the most important thing. It's so much easier to make changes digitally than it is by hand, especially at the early stages. So that's essentially this whole deck of cards idea, right? Think of it as kind of digitally assisted design. I mean, the end result is a handmade, it's hand painted, hand finished, but essentially you're still only using computers to create something that you could also have done manually, right? Albeit way more slowly and with a lot more work. But it's not really, you haven't really entered any new territory where the computer is kind of taking over and doing something that couldn't be done manually. Um, so, which is why I wanted to kind of lastly show you another project that I worked on where I really kind of was interested in producing something that looked very traditional and classical, but at the same time, you kind of look at it like not really sure how it's made, right? Because it's looks handmade, but then it couldn't really be. So a while ago, back in 2012, I think it was, I was asked by a designer friend of mine, Mark Huffman, to create a large folding screen for a pied-à-terre project he had in Washington, D.C. So to begin with, I opened up a Photoshop document with some basic kind of color shapes that I had in there, and then started layering on some textures, some old daguerreotype photographs that I'd found, some textures from old fresco samples that I'd hand painted, and just kind of building up textures very slowly. Added some trees that I'd kind of created from old photographs, reflected them as if there was a high horizon, as if there was like a water source beneath, and started adjusting with the colors and playing around with it till I got it to where I wanted. I still felt that like this was quite dark, and it ended up actually being a little bit lighter, and I adjusted the hue obviously to tie in with the color scheme. I finished it with some contemporary geometric shapes and branches to suggest the kind of stenciling of flowers that I'd seen on some old traditional Byobu Japanese screens. Another time, I was asked to create an album cover for a friend of mine, and the same theme kept cropping up. But this time, added more birds from photographs I'd taken up at the park, and the trees became a little bit more prominent. And I think there's a house in there because it referred to one of the songs as well. But it's funny how, once an idea is in your head, you start to see it everywhere. I happened to be sitting in a window at a coffee shop in the West Village here in the city, and I noticed these shadows of leaves and these misty lines on the wall. It was exactly what I'd been trying to do in my work. I've always loved folding screens, and especially, the combination of this painterliness and a strong graphic sensibility that you see in Japanese art. The older ones also have this fantastic broken texture that's created by the gold leaf that you can see here. So I'd hand painted this Japanese folding screen some years ago, also for Mark Huffman, and I'd always wanted to revisit these kind of graphic finger clouds, I think they're called, the shapes that are in gold, especially with the combination of these softer organic forms of the trees. I'd also recently been exploring the idea of taking some of those same formal compositional elements of traditional Japanese folding screens and combining them with the landscape tradition of 17th century European Baroque painters. It might seem like a strange marriage, but I was intrigued by what I saw as a kind of a common formal theme of a kind of idealized naturalism, along with that classical sense of the cross between the pastoral and the sublime landscape. It's equally beautiful and awe-inspiring. And around then, a designer friend, Philip Sides, approached me with an opportunity to create a mural for his room at the Atlanta Show House. And he gave me a very loose brief. He sent me a bunch of samples and basically asked me what I wanted to do, which I'm so grateful for. So it seemed like the perfect opportunity to see if I could pull off this idea of mine. Given that the show house has a typically tight deadline and the scope of what I was intending to do single-handedly and remotely, I knew that, digital technology was going to have to play a large part in the production here. So I started gathering all the elements that I'd already done, like these old tree paintings that were quite small, and I just scanned them all in because I knew they were going to come in handy later on as background elements. And I collected more texture files like these old daguerreotypes and basically just erased the creepy old faces in the background until I was left with just the textures. And then I started creating brand new elements. I was going to need some stylized flowers and grasses like the ones on the old screens I'd seen. So I painted them using black sumi ink on paper and then scanned them all in. Along with some grass images that I found in an old Japanese book of calligraphy that I had. Once I'd brought everything into Photoshop, I could start arranging things in grassy tufts, in groupings, and also inverting my images, just basically making it white on black versus black on white, because I knew I was going to need some kind of negative shapes as well in my final image. And at the end, I had enough of these images in the computer that if I was careful, you wouldn't really see any repeats. Another visual element you can see in that last image is that broken kind of gridded texture of the gold leaf that I'd seen on those antique screens. And this is something that I really couldn't paint by hand. Wasn't actually going to gold leaf anything, but I definitely wanted to try and achieve that kind of a look. So I started by building this black and white pattern, this gridded pattern in Photoshop using found textures and brushes that are native to Photoshop. And then I created these kind of random graphic shapes of the large blocks of water in black and white and superimposed with my texture files. And you can actually see some of that gold leaf texture in there too in the background. And once I'd put the two together and applied the color, it was ready to insert into the background of the mural. And you can see in the lighter areas of the water shapes that I've inverted the gridded pattern so that it shows up. So the next thing I wanted to create was that drippy texture to make it feel like a light rain or fog. And at first I played with these graphic foreground branches, but I didn't like them, so I dropped that idea. And you can see me playing around with layers here until I get something that I like. The last frame is the drip texture that I actually went with, although in the end, when I apply it, I soften it and superimpose it more like a haze. The ripples I drew in Photoshop and then randomized across the surface the way they're placed and sized, and then I put them underneath a kind of a texture layer and broke up the edges a bit so they weren't just these perfect computer drawn circles. And for the trees, I began with photographs that I'd taken at the local park here in Brooklyn, and then I ran them through a bunch of filters. One of them gives it a kind of a vertical motion blur that you can see here. And once I've combined all the separate elements, the hand-painted trees, the grass that I've painted in ink, and the kind of other leaves that I've painted in ink, and all of the different elements that I've kind of created in Photoshop into this like large mural, I was quite happy with the result. I mean, it really doesn't look like anything that I've seen before, and certainly kind of has that hand-painted feel to it that I was looking for. But also it's kind of clear that it really couldn't be hand painted. There are too many things in there that would be impossible to actually paint. So that's really kind of the look I was hoping to go for in the end. So I did another variation for this lake house. This is a photograph of out the back at the lake. It's absolutely beautiful. It reminded me of those old pictorialist landscape photographers, and so I thought this was a great opportunity to just, take another stab at this thing and kind of boost up some of that kind of romantic charm. And the great thing about, obviously doing this in Photoshop and having all these individual separate elements is that when I get a brand new set of elevations like this for the lake house, they're getting a whole new mural. They're not getting the same thing. It's not like it's just, you're not printing a scan of one thing, of one painting. I'm building it completely in Photoshop in a custom for each space. So for the main kind of feature wall, we'll call it, in this dining room at the lake house, I created a new panel completely, basically.